You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Welcome back to the Bible in Context. This time we're having on Phil Bray, the author of Leviticus on the Butcher's Block. He and I have been talking a bit about the two goats motif and how it fits into Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The two goats motif is a literary pattern that I detailed in my book Through the Waters. I showed how it went throughout the book of Genesis, but I didn't talk about its relationship to the New Testament very much. And so this conversation is going to be between myself, Nate, and Phil, and we're really just going to take the next 3 episodes to explore the two goats motif and to see how the New Testament authors use the concepts of the two goats motif to point us to Jesus. And I thought this conversation was really helpful to have. I thought it was a lot of fun to have. And so I hope that over the next 3 episodes, you will find this to be very helpful too. We have with us today the author of Leviticus on the Butcher's Block. I'm going to have a conversation about Leviticus and some work that I've done as well and how that points forward to Jesus. So, Phil Bray, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, yeah, I'm super happy to be here. I'm excited about this chat.
Awesome. Well, you're going to be kind of our resident Leviticus expert today as we kind of talk through some of the ritual that we find in Leviticus and how it points to Jesus, how he fulfills it and how he doesn't, kind of clear up some of the confusion around those ideas. So first of all, I just want to mention that Phil, he has written recently a very good book called, again, Leviticus on the Butcher's Block, breaking down a lot of the confusing language and confusing passages all throughout Leviticus and breaking it down into terms that are just very easy to understand. It's really a work, I think, unlike any other, because typically your options have been to go to a very complicated commentary or, well, yeah, that's really just been your options. And now you have this book, which is breaking down a lot of really good scholarship and making Leviticus an understandable book from the standpoint of a modern occupation, being a butcher. So, Phil, tell us a little bit more about your book, what led you to write it, and what are your goals and what are you teaching people with it?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, like you said, pretty much all the books on Leviticus are like academic works, or they've been written by scholars, and I kind of joke that they're sitting in a dusty study with cats and they haven't ever come into contact with a bull or a lamb or never seen a sacrifice. Not saying that I have seen a sacrifice, but I've encountered many animals.
You effectively do it every day, though. It's kind of your job.
Yeah. Without the rituals.
Right.
So you're actually a butcher?
I'm a qualified butcher. Yeah, I'm not working anymore. But yeah, I did my apprenticeship and I worked for a few years as a butcher. So yeah, I've got my ticket. I am bona fide qualified butcher.
Awesome. And I just have to say, like, throughout the book, I think that gives you a lot of insights that help you understand the ritual slaughter aspects that the priest is going through. You're able to bring it into the real world in a really interesting way. And also it's a good humored book as well. It's a lot easier to read than my own, actually.
I love your book, but I love nerdy topics. That's probably why we're chatting.
I appreciate it.
But yeah, I wrote the book intentionally as a non-academic work. So I wrote it from the perspective of a butcher, looking at Leviticus, but predominantly the sacrificial rituals in Leviticus and the ancient Near East, but mainly Leviticus and what the priests do, how they divide up the portions into meat. So we talk a lot about meat, talk a bit about slaughter, because I've got some experience with that. But just kind of one of the surprising things I learnt as studying Leviticus. So I should say I'm not a scholar, like I don't have scholarly or academic tickets, but I have been studying Atonement and Leviticus for like 7 or 8 years. So while I don't have good grasp of languages or anything like technically like that, it's something I've been studying pretty passionately for a long time.
What got you started? Like, what drove you to pick Leviticus of all the books of the Bible?
Yeah. Great question. So I was brought up pretty conservative Sydney Anglican, which is pretty Calvinist in its doctrine and pretty narrow in that sense. And then at one point I got listening to Bible Project and Tim Mackey, and I guess he kind of, it's not what he said, but it's that he gave me license to read the Bible on its own terms. So all these doctrines that I had been taught and had assumed were just truth or gospel, he kind of gave me permission to go back and read the Bible for what it says. And then there was just one throwaway comment in a Bible study small group that I was at where they said something about atonement. And I thought, yeah, that's true. That's the gospel. And I went home and tried to find it in my Bible and I couldn't find it. And then that kind of, I was like, well, if that's not in the Bible, then maybe everything else isn't true. So I went down this massive rabbit hole of researching atonement, and eventually it led me to Leviticus, and something about Leviticus just kind of clicked. It would kind of cut through all the nasty atonement debates, and people get really passionate about atonement debates, and there's a lot of anger and passion. For some reason, I understood Leviticus, and it was a way around those debates where if you just talk about sacrifice in its ancient context, and understand sacrifice a little bit better, it just helped to make a lot more sense of what's happening with offering a gift to God and the sharing of a meal and communion and the altar and what's happening with blood. It just made sense. And then when I realized I'm a butcher and I understand it probably better than most people do, just from having worked with it and experienced it and lived it, I thought, I had so many notes that I'd taken down as I was listening to lectures and reading books and whatever, and I thought I should just write a book on all of this from the perspective of a butcher. And this is what came out, my book.
Well, yeah, I think it turned out great. I mean, like you said, you're not a scholar, but he has really, I think, combed through some really good resources, and he has a very good grasp on the scholarly debates going around Leviticus. So, yeah, I think it's a great book. Founded on a lot of really good research. Just first of all, thank you for the book. It's very good. And I had the pleasure of getting to read it. So also, there's a few other topics just in that initial statement that I think we could jump on and have a whole podcast on. I wish we had the time for it, because I feel like, Nate and we have both done kind of the same thing, just with re-examining things, I suppose, to put it one way, and being challenged and come to places that we may not have expected. And also for me, it started out with watching the Spiritual Beings Bible Project video, and I was like, this is nuts. And they say, this is all thanks to this one guy, Michael Heiser. I was like, okay, he's probably nuts, but who is he? So I looked him up, and then that started just everything that I've been on now with all of my biblical research stuff. So very similar beginnings.
And Mike Heiser has a great series on Leviticus as well.
Well, yeah, he does. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I believe, Nate, I could be wrong, but I think this got started for you because I was like, hey, you should check out this book that I read, Unseen Realm. And
I blame you.
You were like, I like this, but I hate it so much.
Yeah, well, and I had been exposed to the Bible Project stuff before you had given me Michael Heiser's book, but it really was, because up until that point, I had really just watched the videos and not really... in the videos are good, but they're usually they're for an audience, not for a scholarly audience. But you go deeper into their podcasts and then into some of his other teachings, and you are exposed. And like you said, Phil, I mean, it did the same thing for me. It gave me, I guess, permission to start reading the Bible on its own terms, and that was super helpful. And I think it was actually where a lot of the light bulb coming on was as I was walking through the classroom on Ephesians, actually, and just seeing how, I had always been taught this is what election is and this is what predestination is, and he kind of flipped everything upside down. And
just using the Old Testament.
Yeah, just using the Old Testament, and all of a sudden it just started becoming more and more clear. And similar paths. Yeah,
and go back to what you were saying, like we got to understand the Old Testament, and coming to Jesus with that puts a whole new lens on things. So back to what we were kind of planning on talking about here. So we wanted to kind of examine the two goats motif, which definitely gets into some Leviticus and atonement territory. We are going to try and maybe steer around some of the larger debates, but I think there's a lot to say that everyone here in general can see through the two goats motif to understand Jesus better. So I think there's a lot of applicability here, without getting into maybe things like penal substitutionary atonement. Our thoughts on that and things that we might kind of skirt around those topics a little bit.
I was intentional in my book about avoiding that. In my area, it's a very core belief.
Same here.
And I didn't want to ostracize people or get people offside. And that's part of the reason why Leviticus was, I think, a good way in, or appealing to me, because I just talked about sacrifice. I kind of intentionally left unsaid all of that atonement, penal substitution debate, because it gets really messy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like you just said, you'll very quickly ostracize half of an audience. But I think in your book and what we're going to be discussing here, I'm not even sure if all three of us agree on that. We all have our own thoughts on that. But there's so much applicability outside of that that let's not nail down on that quite yet. Maybe one day. That would be a good topic, but maybe another day. So we'll talk about the two goats motif and how does Jesus fulfill that typological thread that runs through the Torah up into Leviticus and then is recapitulated in some New Testament texts through Jesus. Before we jump into that, we have to know, so the two goats that I'm talking about are the two goats from Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. And so, real quickly, Phil, can you tell us what is the Day of Atonement? What are some of the processes, especially with the goats, and what does the Day of Atonement do? What's its function?
Yeah, it's not a small question. So by the time you read about Day of Atonement, it's chapter 16 in Leviticus, and it's the center. So if you know anything about chiasms, the center often helps you understand what's on either side. And as Bible Project would say, Hebrew scriptures are designed to be read forwards and backwards, and you probably won't understand in its entirety the fullness of it until you understand what's at the center. And then I kind of liken it to standing on top of a bridge. So once you're on the top of the bridge, you can see both sides. You can see up and down each side, and it makes a whole lot more sense.
I like that.
Yeah, so you kind of walk up the bridge, journey from the beginning of the book to the middle. You can see it. You journey down the other side, but then you go back and so Day of Atonement's in the middle, which means that it must be kind of a pivot point.
Well, what's it in the middle of?
Well, yes. So in the middle of Leviticus, but also in the middle of the Torah. And Leviticus itself is in the middle of the Torah. So two books on either side. You've got Exodus and Numbers that bracket Leviticus. They're both narratives of wandering in the wilderness. They actually both, so Carmen Imes has helped me with this. She shows how many of the events in Exodus and Numbers mirror each other. So I think it's designed to draw your focus to Leviticus, where time just stops. It's all set in the one place at Mount Sinai. They're in the wilderness, but they're meeting God. And I think basically that's the whole point of Leviticus. It's how do you meet God? How do you draw near to a holy God? And how is God going to live in the midst of his people? And that when humans get involved, that becomes messy. And so how Leviticus is the book that explains how that's going to happen. And sacrifice is part of that picture.
And with this being the center,
So
not
before
only
you
of
get to
Leviticus,
Dave,
but of the Torah, like this is effectively the point of the Torah. So keep that in mind. This is a central core idea.
Yep. So when you start reading about Day of Atonement, you've already read about all the sacrifices. You've read about all the priestly instructions of purifying altars and purifying priests. So that all has to happen first. And then Day of Atonement, basically, it's such a big topic to try and to distill down, but you can't understand the word atonement, I don't think, without the whole Day of Atonement. And it's not just a single act. So Tyndale invented the word atonement because he thought it meant something to at one meant. So he thought it meant becoming at one with God, which is great until you realize atonement is made for an altar and for a tent. So becoming at one with a tent isn't something that you'd probably want to do. So atonement has something to do with wiping away or cleansing impurity and wiping away or removing sin and impurity. So you have the two goats, which we'll talk about a lot, I guess. And one goat is a sin offering, a sacrifice that is primarily used as a cleansing tool. So it comes, the lifeblood of the animal is used to cleanse the altar and the mercy seat. So no one ever went into the most holy place where the mercy seat is, which is where God's presence appeared. The high priest only went in once a year. And so you have two goats. One of them, the lifeblood of that unblemished goat, goes all the way into holy space and cleanses the space. And then after the space has been cleansed, then the other goat has all of the iniquities and transgressions and sins of all of Israel placed on its head, and that's sent out of the camp. So you're basically cleansing the space, the tabernacle and the space, and then you're removing the sin outside the camp to cleanse the space and the people. So at the end of the day, the people are atoned for and the space is atoned for, and they're cleansed. So at the end of Leviticus 16, it says, and at the end of the day, the people were cleansed, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and so just to orient around, you got into a little bit of like the function there. And so would it be better to call it the day of purgation, the day of purging, or the day of purification, something like that? Does the Day of Atonement really capture it all that well?
Yeah. I've been wondering what word is best, because atonement has a lot of baggage. But yeah, the day of cleansing or the day of removal, removal's half of it. It's a
Right.
purification and a cleansing as well, or a wiping away. So yeah, I haven't landed on a word that
Yeah,
I
I
like
mean,
yet.
scholars go back and forth on what are the best terms, but I think, kind of just naming all those things, it kind of gives you the idea that, again, yeah, this is about that the point is purification, cleansing the camp, removing things, you're purging the uncleanness away, and so there's a lot of ideas going on, but you get the idea that at one-ment with the altar, with the tent, or something like that, that's not entirely the whole idea. There's a removal of something, and that's what that go away goat, the goat for Azazel, the scapegoat, whatever you want to call it there, that's what that one's doing. And the other one, the blood of the sacrificed goat, is being spiritual soap to facilitate that cleansing. Uh,
I kind of like the word restoration. So you're restoring something, the space and the people back to their ideal state.
yeah, yeah. That I like that in a just in describing what the day does. I think that would be a really good title, the Day of Restoration. Okay, so the way that this relates to the rest of our conversation with the two goats motif is the pattern that the goats go through. They are both selected by God for their various roles through the Urim and the Thummim being cast over them. The ancient Near Eastern dice that they roll to assign the goats. You have the Urim and the Thummim selecting the goats, which is God selecting the goats. Then one is chosen to go away, bearing the sins of the people. The other one is chosen to be brought closer to Yahweh's space, and here is used for a cleansing and is a purification offering, a sin offering. There is that pattern running throughout in a form throughout Genesis with the brothers. If you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you know this, or if you've read Through the Waters, you know this. I'll go real quickly just through what the steps of the two goats motif in Genesis are, but go listen to our episodes on Cain and Abel as a start. We also talk about this a lot in the Joseph episodes, so we talk about this several times throughout the podcast. Just find an episode about two brothers and you'll get it. So within this motif, there's, again, a younger brother who is elected to be the firstborn or the bearer of the seed of the woman promise. There is a brother who acts with jealousy against that elect brother. Then the older brother who has acted with jealousy, he's given some form of protection. And then the older brother is exiled into the wilderness. Sometimes with Cain, he's bearing not his sin, but his avon, his punishment. And so it's very similar language there. And then the older brother, he is always multiplied into a nation which becomes hostile to God's people. And then the elect brother is brought closer to Yahweh into his dwelling, and sometimes is associated with a sacrifice of some sort, an offering of some sort. And so there's not always a one-to-one correspondence between the brothers and the goats, but there is this pattern of being chosen, one being exiled, one being brought closer to Yahweh's space, and then reconciliation being kind of at the pinnacle of the motif with Joseph. And so ultimately, I think, like you just said, the Day of Atonement, its function is restoration. And we see that, I think, with Joseph. He becomes both goats in this motif. He is both the chosen one to bring forward the promises of the seed of the woman. He is also the one who is exiled and sent out in a sense, bearing the wrongs that his brothers have done to him. And through this, he does a lot of things that we maybe will mention here that be able to reconcile the broken chosen family. And so I think we're going to see, ultimately, I think we can all agree, no matter what side of any debate you're on, that is a function that Jesus does accomplish, the reconciliation of humanity, and in particular with him and with his Father, with God. So beyond that, I think it'd be helpful to take a look at how exactly should we understand the cultic function of the goats, the ritual function of the goats, and what Jesus did. Did Jesus accomplish the point of the Day of Atonement, the reconciliation, or did he actually perform in some way a Day of Atonement ritual that caused the reconciliation?
Yeah, so whatever we say, I think you'd agree that Day of Atonement isn't central to the gospel accounts. It's there, but it's not a central theme. Like, I think Passover is more prominent than Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
So you've often got to look for it, and the more you read about it, the more you see it.
Yeah.
But it's not immediately obvious.
Well, definitely. And I think a lot of this conversation comes from places like Exodus 25:9, 25:40, and in Hebrews 8:5, where we're told that the tabernacle was a copy of the heavenly things. And so we kind of get this question in the church: is the entire process a copy? Is it an abstraction of what Moses saw when he went up the mountain and God showed him the heavenly realm? Or did Moses give a carbon copy of the heavenly processes? Are the processes part of the heavenly things, or are the processes just meant to represent and point forward to the heavenly things?
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, but and then when you think about the pagan nations, because they had altars and they were offering sacrifices to gods, so where did they get that idea from? Like, were they copying a demonic idea, or were they copying Yahweh's original idea and they just, wrecked it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder about a third option, that it was kind of their own idea and Yahweh is adopting it for the sake of communicating. That's a third option to put on the table. We'll see if we get there or not.
Yep. I guess so. What you said before, how if you see Joseph as being a goat that was exiled and sent away, and yet he redeems a people, that is in contrast to a goat that is exiled and having sin placed on it, which like Joseph wasn't in the wrong, and yet he was exiled and redeemed people. But other brothers, and possibly the goat, you could see some kind of punishment or consequence of sin on them.
Right.
But when you start talking about Jesus, are we talking about him experiencing the punishment that perhaps the goat for Azazel experienced? Or is he more like a Joseph figure who experiences the sin that was done to him and then somehow redeems it by being like, that Joseph kind of
right.
David redeeming figure?
Well, yeah, I think what you're hitting on there is, the goats and also the high priest in some texts and numbers, they bear sins in a more metaphysical sense. Like the metaphysical wrongdoings that we have done are placed on them to be either carried away or to be, when the high priest dies, the sins of murders are let go. So there's a sense in which they carry metaphysical sin. Whenever you get into Genesis, it seems like if there's any sin being carried by the goat for Azazel brothers, they are carrying sin in the sense of bearing wrongdoing. And it's interesting too that word bearing is also the same word for forgive in a lot of places. If you carry someone's sin, you're bearing the weight of that for them. You're letting that weight off of them. It's effectively how in Hebrew they communicate forgiveness in a lot of places. So I guess it brings the question to, what kind of bearing of sin did Jesus do? Is it forgiveness? Is it bearing wrongdoings done to him? Is it some sort of metaphysical carrying of sins away from the camp and killing them in his death. And I've thought about, I think I've aligned with all three of those things at different points. And I think I've come to a more solid point. Again, that's kind of what we're here talking about.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.